Payment rails that settle without middlemen. None of that is mystical. All of it hits somebody's margin. Unknown to most of us, there's also the culture piece. During the 194's war push, secrecy saved lives. Afterward, classification inertia stuck. Temporary controls never fully rolled back. Dual-use tech, energy materials, sensors got pulled into big defense umbrellas. Universities signed IP pipelines to industry partners who managed commercialization. Translation. Gatekeeping moved earlier in the life of an idea. The plot thickens when you trace language. FOIA clusters show agencies lifting the same phrases that turn up in private briefings. Premature deployment risk, grid stability concern, unverified safety envelope. Standards minutes echo corporate decks. Funding spikes align with kill decisions. It looks less like chaos, more like choreography. So who profits? Anyone selling scarcity and fragility. If the grid bleeds heat, you finance more capacity. If engines waste fuel, you sell more fuel and maintenance. If city procurement can't verify performance, it rents the same old backups at a premium. If data must cross guarded moats, toll collectors smile. Here's where it gets crazy but practical. It only works as long as we believe nothing better passed the test. The embargo machine bets you'll never see the files, the rescinded orders, the shelved pilots that quietly worked. We've mapped the playbook. With that in hand, we pull the first thread and step into the 1940s, where the norms took root and the lock clicked. The 1940s breakpoints, war labs to black boxes. 3 years earlier, inside windowless rooms, the rulebook changed. Scientists who just built radar and cracked codes walked out of the war with a new reflex. Lock it down first, ask later. Look, I'm gonna tell you something. The secrecy made sense when submarines lurked offshore. But when the shooting stopped, the habits didn't. They hardened. To understand why, we need to go back to the war labs. Los Alamos, MIT's Rad Lab, Bell's microwave rooms. Teams solved impossible problems on insane timelines because everything flowed in tight circles. Clearance defined who knew what, and need to know was law. After the surrender, nobody flipped a switch and said, "Okay, open season." Agencies kept the machinery humming. Temporary orders rolled forward. Dual use became the magic phrase that pulled civilian breakthroughs under defense umbrellas. Meanwhile, something else was happening. Industry had tasted the power of uniform standards. Wartime procurement had simplified specs to move metal by the mile. In peacetime, those habits kept factories full, but they also froze lanes. If your idea didn't fit the post-war template, it hit guardrails. Not a villain's plot, just the path of least resistance for committees that didn't want surprises. Here's where the irony bites. The 1940s weren't just about bombs and radios. The labs also tripped over early energy anomalies, odd heat signatures in materials, strange conversion effects at small scales, data that didn't fit tidy models yet. Engineers flagged them, logged them, and then watched as classification tags swallowed the follow-up. Not because someone whispered free energy, but because any hint of novel power or propulsion now looked like a national asset. Safer to classify it and kick the can. Standards started doing quiet work too. Once you lock a spec for transformers, fuels, bearings, you create momentum. Buyers train to the spec, test rigs mirror it. What nobody knew at the time was how those frozen specs would sideline misfit wins. Take high-density storage proofs. Early flywheel concepts, steel rotors in vacuum housings, showed startling charge-discharge cycles in lab notes. They weren't grid-ready. They were clunky. But the properties were real, instant response, absurd cycle life. Instead of a red flag that said, "Develop this," the note said, "Non-standard failure risk." Filing cabinets closed. The conversation died. Unknown to the young post-war scientists, patent policy was shifting under their feet. Wartime withholding had been emergency law. Then, right at the edge of the decade, peacetime thinking set the stage for permanent tools. Agencies made lists, what to scan, what to flag, what to hold. Power supply wasn't a category anyone debated on TV. It lived in memos. If your application touched it, the review didn't happen in public. The human moments were small but telling. A metallurgist in Ohio shipped a sample of an amorphous ribbon, thin, glassy, with low magnetic loss to a colleague in New Jersey. The letter back praised the numbers, then asked, "What's the certification path?" There wasn't one. Utilities were ordering post-war growth with iron cores and copper windings by the ton. A procurement officer circled experimental and moved to the next file. In the aftermath, the metallurgist didn't stop. He just aimed for parts that fit existing specs. The big leap waited for a decade that never seemed to arrive. Now remember, this is the 1940s. Debt from war is still on the books. Politicians promise stability. Scarcity economics turns into a business plan, build more of the proven, sell security at scale. The unintended side effect is a culture that sees novelty as noise unless it salutes the flag in a purchasing guide. Early heat-to-power tricks, thermoelectric gradients tested on factory exhaust, got logged as curiosities, good enough to power a sensor in the Arctic. Not worth a standards fight on the shop floor. What nobody outside the circles saw was the subtle shift in journals. Editors weren't censors, they were cautious. A paper on high-temperature ceramics that hinted at engine parts running hotter and cleaner drew reviewer notes like, promising but lacks service data. Fair notes. The catch is, service data requires pilots. Pilots require specs. Specs require committees. You see the loop. Meanwhile, the universities cut deals. Post-war funding ran through defense lines. Professors who'd led wartime projects brought that money home. Campus IP policies evolved fast. Discoveries moved to tech transfer offices, then into industry partnerships. The pitch was simple, commercialize faster. The practice was slower. If the partner's main business didn't love the disruption, the path narrowed. Get this, the first missing link wasn't a UFO engine. It was boring, practical, high-density storage and materials that promised lower losses and higher temps. They could have set up the 195s for a different energy arc. Smaller plants, tighter grids, less waste. Instead, momentum won. The black boxes didn't just hide secrets, they hid options. Here's where it gets crazy but clear. Nobody in 1948 said, let's erase the future. They said, let's keep the ship steady. The war labs taught them to close ranks. The standards taught them to prefer what fits. The money taught them to avoid public failure. And the patents about to live under new, permanent eyes taught them to treat power as a sensitive word. So we leave the 1940s with a locked door and a key nobody thinks they need. The habits are set. The categories exist. The early blips are in drawers. We step into the 195s believing progress is a straight line. It is. It's a lane they drew and guarded. The 1950s, 1960, utility monopolies and the Great Stall. While that locked door from the 194 stayed shut, something slower and heavier moved into place. Utilities consolidated. Local co-ops and oddball municipals got folded into state-regulated behemoths. The rate-based model took over, build bigger plants, stretch more lines, earn a guaranteed return on whatever sits in the ground. Look, I'm gonna tell you something unsexy but crucial. When you profit by adding capital, you don't love tech that shrinks it. Their perspective, stability mattered. Blackouts made governors furious. So planners drew 10, 20-year curves and fed them into mega projects, coal units, steam turbines, step-up transformers, long corridors of copper. Anything novel had to prove it wouldn't wobble the curve. Grid-scale storage. Interesting, but where's the tariff? Heat to power from low-grade exhaust. Cute for labs, but where's the test code? Meanwhile, accounting rules rewarded safe bulk and punished small, nimble gear. 3 days earlier, in a standards boardroom, language hardened. Trial procedures were written around silicon steel transformer cores everyone already knew. Procurement templates baked in equivalents that weren't equivalent. If you came in with amorphous metal cores that cut core losses by 60–70% on paper, you hit a strange wall. Not no, just not yet, needs more service data. And then this is the play. Service data couldn't exist because the specs refused you onto the system. Doors open, then loop back to the hallway. Meanwhile, labs shifted their posture. Big company R&D, flush from wartime wins, got told to de-risk. Incremental innovation, product line support, manufacturing readiness, phrases that sound smart and feel safe. Senior engineers still sketched bold ideas on napkins. Adiabatic engine parts that run hotter, direct conversion tricks to turn waste heat into watts, flywheel prototypes in vacuum cans. But inside review committees, the notes kept circling: unstable, manufacturing risk, field failures catastrophic, safer to polish what ships. The auto sector learned the same dance. By the late 1950s, unit sales and parts revenue set the tempo. Light, clean, durable, these traits help drivers, but they hurt service bays. Carb tuning, gasket changes, frequent rebuilds, those were profit centers. Quietly, projects that stretched oil change intervals or promised engines running cooler and cleaner got boxed as experimental. Few demos leaked into magazines, then citations stopped. The decision would matter decades later, when every MPG started to count. What nobody knew at the time was how liability memos became vetoes. A utility council didn't need to say ban amorphous cores. He just wrote, unknown aging profile, warranty exposure unacceptable. A hospital facilities chief didn't have to ban a new heat-to-power module, he just forwarded. Certification pathway undefined. Insurers read the same notes and priced risk like a warning siren. That's the soft kill. You don't outlaw the idea, you make it unbuyable. Meanwhile, something else was happening in semiconductors. Early off-ramps for lower power, longer life logic were visible. Alternative device geometries, gallium-based switches, high-efficiency power stages, ideas that could have cut waste at the edge of every machine. But planned obsolescence paid the bills. Shorter life cycles meant recurring sales. The research didn't vanish, but it got shunted into niche programs, defense corners, or roadmaps labeled post-197. By then, the ecosystem would be set around heat-hungry silicon and big central plants feeding dumb loads. Are you sitting down? Because standards lock-in gets weird at street level. City procurement wrote specs mirroring state utility guides. If those guides didn't list a novel storage bank or a low-grade heat harvester, city buyers couldn't even ask for it. Engineers tried to write performance-based specs, but vendors challenged them as non-competitive. So departments reinserted the old language to avoid delays. A 6-month pilot died in paragraph 13 of a purchasing manual nobody remembers signing. Here's a micro story. A plant engineer in Ohio ran a weekend test on a duct heater retrofitted with thermoelectric plates. Tiny output, but steady. He sketched a path. Capture just a slice of waste heat across the mill, power sensors, reduce maintenance calls, maybe backfeed trickles at shift change. Monday, his boss liked it, but asked for UL listings, interconnect approvals, insurance letters, and a vendor with 5 years of field data. None existed because nobody had let them exist. The file went to a drawer labeled Revisit Q4. Trust me, you're not ready for how circular it feels when you read the minutes. Committees cited grid stability to block storage pilots, then cited no operational data to deny the next application. Utilities flagged customer safety to stall small generators, then sold diesel gensets with known hazards because they had a spec. The motive wasn't mustache twirling. It was comfort, revenue models, and habits that paid. Now remember, this is the 1960s. Highways spread. Suburbs need air conditioning. Base load rises like a clean ramp for investment bankers. Every new ton of cooling locks the system tighter to centralized generation and long wires humming day and night. A radical efficiency jump in motors or transformers would have shaved that ramp. That sounds great for households. It's awkward for rate-based growth. The great stall isn't a crash, it's a glide path that avoids steep climbs. By the end of the 196s, the machine had taught itself the rules. Big beats small, proven beats better, safer beats cheaper, and anything that doesn't fit the template waits outside. On paper, progress marched on. On the ground, misfit breakthroughs froze at the gate. Everything was about to change when oil politics slammed into this comfy grid. The 197s should have cracked it open. Instead, someone patched it. The 1970s, oil shocks, silent solutions. While that was happening in boardrooms, tankers stalled and lines wrapped around blocks. Odd even gas days, price spikes, governors on TV begging for calm. On paper, a perfect moment for efficiency to break through. In practice, crisis became cover. Emergency powers tightened control. Price caps and allocation rules rewarded volume players who knew the maze. New tech that cut demand, it threatened every deal that ran on scarcity. Get this, behind the panic, engineers were quietly solving pieces of the puzzle. Low-grade heat lives everywhere, factory stacks, dryers, kilns. Teams built modules to sip that waste and turn it into power. Not miracles, just steady trickles that add up. But code officials didn't know where to file them. Not a generator, not an appliance. Without a category, permits stalled. Liability memos did the rest. Unknown failure envelope. A safer choice, they said, was diesel backups and more copper. You know the ending, another year of waste. Meanwhile, something else was happening in engines. A kid from El Paso rolled a black box into the spotlight and the story got strange fast. Tom Ogle, 20-something, grease under his nails, pulled the carb and fuel pump from a Ford Galaxy and ran vaporized gasoline straight to the chambers. In 1977, newspapers showed him driving under watch, claiming 100 to 160 miles per gallon. Local professors looked at the rig and didn't see obvious fraud. He filed a patent, investors circled, then the pressure came. From Ogle's perspective, he'd cracked a lever big enough to move the market. But contracts got messy. Rights split between marketing and development. Regulators sniffed around. A company with rights drew an SEC complaint, its finances, not the tech, freezing momentum. Engineers who wanted to replicate couldn't get clean drawings. He kept at it anyway, then hit a wall no one his age could punch through. In 1981, he was dead. Alcohol and drugs, the coroner said. The box went dark. The filings sat in a system that didn't want to touch them. Now remember, we're not saying a vapor rig breaks physics. We're saying it challenged a fuel system that fed parts and service for decades. And in the fog of crisis, every bureaucracy had a reason to wait. Safety, emissions, standards, warranty risk. If it worked, it starved sales. If it failed, it burned reputations. Safer to let the story become an urban legend. Safer to tell the public the carb myth is a hoax and move on. While the public argued about miracle carbs, factories tried to harvest heat. Thermoelectrics sat on pipes and made little watts with no moving parts. Thermophotovoltaics looked at glowing furnaces and saw electricity in the infrared. Both needed time on real lines. Both hit a quiet wall, no procurement path. Committees asked for certification tracks that didn't yet exist. Vendors couldn't sell without the certs. A loop inside a loop. Advanced materials were stuck too. High-temperature ceramics and coatings pointed to engines that could run hotter with less cooling. Ceramic engine concepts, the adiabatic dream, moved from papers into test cells. In Japan, DMOS ran without coolant, higher thermal efficiency baked in. The US defense side liked ceramics for missiles and blades, but export rules fenced off the best fibers and processes. Civilian programs lost momentum. Labels like brittle, uneconomic, and immature manufacturing turned into polite vetoes. By the time the data got good, the appetite had shifted back to safe metals and additives. Meanwhile, grid gear that slashed waste faced a standards freeze. Amorphous metal transformers were not science fiction. Lab numbers showed 60 to 70% cuts in core losses versus silicon steel. In an oil shock, that's free energy. Utilities ran pilots, then parked them behind procurement specs written for the old cores. The story was always the same, compelling but needs more field data. Field data required orders. Orders required specs. The circle closed. Years went by. Your bill stayed padded by heat you never asked to buy. Consumer culture turned disposable at the worst moment. Planned obsolescence fit the scarcity model. Sell more, replace sooner, keep factories humming. Durable machines with hard coatings and long service intervals didn't fit the margin plan. A ceramic that makes an engine last twice as long sounds great, unless you sell rebuilds. A coating that ends wherein pump seals sounds smart, unless you sell the seals. The 197s taught investors a lesson. Efficiency that pays the user often threatens the middle. The media playbook hardened as well. If a lab claimed a leak the headline teased, then the follow-up framed it as fringe. Extraordinary claims, no peer review, one-off demo. Fair cautions, also useful to anyone who liked delay. A documentary or two raised eyebrows was big oil buying and burying. Skeptics answered with physics and asked for data. Then everyone moved on. The result wasn't where it gets crazy, noise that kept buyers scared of being duped. The oil shocks could have forced a pivot to misfit text storage at the edge, cleaner engines, low-loss grids, heat to power everywhere. Instead, the emergency gave regulators and incumbents the tools to tighten the lanes. Allocation, certification, export controls, liability, and standards all sharpened. It looked like order in chaos. It felt like progress. It functioned like a patch over a crack. By decade's end, the panic cooled, but the habits stuck. The public forgot the lines. The system remembered the levers. The 1980s promised competition and freedom. What arrived was consolidation and a colder patent war. The 1980s, consolidation and the patent Cold War. While the panic faded, boardrooms sharpened their knives. Mergers thinned the herd. Conglomerates snapped up labs, then streamlined anything that didn't feed next quarter. Antitrust took a nap. Shareholder value became a creed. Look, I'm gonna tell you something plain. If a breakthrough shaved a cash cow, it died in a spreadsheet long before it hit a test cell. From their perspective, this was discipline. Discipline meant fewer bets, bigger moats, tighter control of IP. The patent office turned into a battlefield, claims, continuations, terminal disclaimers, a chess game with a clock. Lawyers taught engineers to think in fences. Block the lane, slow the rival, license nothing you can smother. That was the new music. And when that wasn't enough, they built thickets, a forest of filings that made moving forward expensive, slow, and legally scary. Meanwhile, something else was happening in certification. High-power electronics were finally ready to jump. Wide bandgap devices, cleaner switches, cooler power stages. But safety became a polite break. Test codes lagged. Certification paths weren't written. Labs could show devices running cooler at higher frequencies, but buyers heard, "No listing yet, talk next year." Next year slid to 3. The momentum bled out. Here's where the ceramic story turns. Japan ran hot on adiabatic engines. Ceramic liners, pistons, turbo housings, parts built to hold heat where it works and ditch coolant where it drags. DMOS ran, efficiency ticked up. The knock on ceramics, brittle, hard to machine, was real, but progress was steady. In U.S. circles, the narrative hardened early. Manufacturing risk, field fragility, uneconomic at scale. Budgets shifted. Programs slipped behind closed doors or into defense corners where export rules fenced the best fibers and matrices. By the time some materials were commercial ready, the window had moved. Gas got cheap. Finance said pass. Telecom told a parallel story. The tools for distributed compute were appearing, smarter edges, local processing, peer networks, but walled gardens paid. Bell had been broken up, sure, but vendor lock revived like a reflex. Proprietary standards slowed open links. The dream of homes and small shops crunching and routing without tolls got delayed behind integration roadmaps. That lag kept central choke points valuable and kept oversight simple for anyone who liked it that way. Meanwhile, grid hardware that could have trimmed losses kept tripping over procurement. Amorphous metal transformers weren't rumors, they worked. Core loss cuts were huge on paper and pilots hinted at meaningful savings. But the standards were old and the test rigs mimicked the old. Committees asked for long-term field data while purchases starved the data they demanded. A few footholds formed overseas. Here, it felt like walking through syrup. The finance turn sealed it. MBAs ran IRR models that punished public spillovers. If a technology made neighborhoods resilient or cut maintenance across an industry, the private buyer ate cost while society banked gains. Those gains didn't show up in the cell that mattered to the CFO. So the killer features, long life, field repairability, lower losses, looked value destructive.